Hello and welcome to the Bartholomew School GCSE English Language Revision video for English Language Paper 2 Question 3. This is the language question and this video is for students in Year 11. We're going to be working through the example paper on the two texts about soldiers. You need to make sure that you have in front of you a copy of Source A from the Help for Heroes website and a copy of Source B, which is also about soldiers, by Charles Dickens. And thirdly, you need the question paper itself. If you don't yet have these, you can access them via the school SharePoint pages, that is the learning platform. So just go to the English page, select Year 10 and 11. When you're there, you should see a folder called Year 11 GCSE English Language, and when you click through, you should find the PDF document called Soldiers Paper. So if you haven't got the paper, pause the video, find the document, print it out, and then we'll be ready to get started. Question 3 is the language question, which focuses on just one of the sources. In this case, you're just asked about source B. So the first thing that we need to do is to read the source. Before going into their wards to visit them, I inquired how they had made their triumphant entry there. They had been brought through the rain, in carts it seemed, from the landing place to the gate, and had then been carried upstairs on the backs of paupers. Their groans and pains during the performance of this glorious pageant had been so distressing as to bring tears into the eyes of spectators but too well accustomed to scenes of suffering. The men were so dreadfully cold that those who could get near the fires were hard to be restrained from thrusting their feet in among the blazing coals. They were so horribly reduced that they were awful to look upon. Racked with dysentery and blackened with scurvy, 140 wretched soldiers had been revived with brandy and laid in bed. A medical officer laid before us a handful of rotten biscuit and a handful of split peas. The biscuit was a honeycombed heap of maggots, and the excrement of maggots. The peas were even harder than this filth. A similar handful had been experimentally boiled 6 hours, and had showed no signs of softening. These were the stores on which the soldiers had been fed. We went into a large ward, containing some 25 beds. We went into several such wards, one after another. I find it very difficult to indicate what a shocking sight I saw in them without frightening the reader from the perusal of these lines and defeating my object of making it known. Oh, the sunken eyes that turned to me as I walked between the rows of beds, or worse still, that gazedly looked at the white ceiling and saw nothing and cared for nothing. Here lay the skeleton of a man, so lightly covered with a thin, unwholesome skin that not a bone in the anatomy was clothed, and I could clasp the arm above the elbow in my finger and thumb. Here lay a man with the black scurvy eating his legs away, his gums gone, and his teeth all gaunt and bare. This bed was empty because gangrene had set in and the patient had died but yesterday. That bed was a hopeless one because its occupant was sinking fast, and could only be roused to turn the poor pinched mask of face upon the pillow with a feeble moan. The awful thinness of the fallen cheeks, the awful brightness of the deep-set eyes, the lips of lead, the hands of ivory, the recumbent human images lying in the shadow of death with a kind of solemn twilight on them, like the 60 who had died aboard the ship and were lying at the bottom of the sea. O Pangloss, God forgive ye. So now turn to the question paper. We'll begin by reading the question itself, and you need a highlighter to do this effectively. Pause the video if you need to get one. You now need to refer to Source B, Dickens's description of the wounded soldiers in hospital. How does Dickens use language to present the wounded men? And this is for 12 marks. Notice that the question just asks you about Source B. The exam paper won't necessarily be about Source B. It might be about Source A, or it could feasibly be about the specific part of one of the sources. So make sure that you pay careful attention to what you're directed to, in this case, Source B. It's very clearly asking you about language. When the question uses the word how, that tells you this is about the writer's methods, and when it uses the word language, it's not just words and phrases, but it's also asking you about language techniques. We're also being given a specific focus. In this case, it's the presentation of the wounded men. You might find that there are other interesting things in the source, but they won't be rewarded if you don't answer the question about wounded men. The planning stage of this answer is really important because to be successful here you need to choose quotations that will give you a reasonable chance of having something to analyse. So spend time now rereading the source with your highlighter and pick out some quotations that you could analyse. Pause the video while you do that. So what could you have spotted? Well, you might have noticed the parallel phrases, or the repeated phrase structure in the description of the men, so dreadfully cold and so horribly reduced. You could describe this as hyperbole or emotive language, and the adverbs dreadfully and horribly intensify the impression of extreme suffering. You might have commented on the disgusting language in the phrase, a honeycombed heap of maggots and the excrement of maggots, with that repetition of the noun maggots driving home the completely unhygienic and frankly horrifying care that the wounded soldiers are being given. So you could talk about the blunt language in the noun excrement, which, if you didn't know, means poo. In a place where the soldiers should be given aid, they're given food which will undoubtedly make them more ill. You'll need to be careful about linking that back to the presentation of wounded soldiers, but if you can talk about the way that they're being treated, that's okay. You might have identified the importance of perspective. So here's a quotation that prioritises the first person. I find it very difficult to indicate what a shocking sight I saw in them. The eyewitness account makes the treatment of the men more shocking, and the fact that Dickens suggests it's inexpressible somehow makes us use our imaginations more because we picture the very worst possible conditions. First person pronouns make this a compelling read because we feel that it really matters to the writer. That last paragraph is really rich in language, and there's lots that you could have identified as being worth talking about. But I've just pulled out the last phrase. It uses a biblical metaphor, the shadow of death, to suggest that the men are already marked to die. There's a heavy sense of threat. It also uses a simile, like the 60 who had died aboard the ship and were lying at the bottom of the sea, to imply that the narrator feels the men are already dead. There's no hope for them. The bottom of the sea image creates an impression that they're unreachable. So now to tackle the paragraphs. You will want to aim to write 4 paragraphs, and you might have a bingo card like this already to help you in your revision notes. This is what we're going to use in this video to structure our response. The first 2 columns are just ideas for techniques that you could comment on. They're colour-coded, the green ones are the easiest to find, the orange ones are slightly more difficult, and then the pink are more difficult to identify still. And that's by no means an exhaustive list. There's lots that you could identify. The blue phrases are the words that you should be using to analyse, and remember, this is where all the marks are. You need to analyse in detail, and therefore use those blue phrases repeatedly. So here is my example. The writer uses emotive language to present the wounded men. For instance, Dickens uses a parallel phrase structure to describe the injured soldiers he sees as so dreadfully cold and so horribly reduced. The use of hyperbole with the intensifying word so makes it seem as though the condition the men are in is the worst it could possibly be. Furthermore, the adjectives cold and reduced imply that they are suffering, because cold suggests that they are not being properly cared for, even though they're in a hospital. Reduced has 2 possible meanings. Firstly, it could suggest that the men are so thin that they are physically smaller and have reduced in size, but more importantly, reduced could suggest that the writer sees them as less human now because of their wounds and their suffering. The adverbs dreadfully and horribly before the adjectives make us feel that the writer's impression is that the condition of these men, wounded men, is extreme and shocking. So I identify a technique that the writer is using in my very first sentence. And in fact, throughout my answer, I'm using techniques, I'm referring to techniques. I also show in my first sentence that I'm answering the question. I offer quotations, and throughout I pull those quotations apart, picking out key lexical choices. And I use the blue phrases all the way through my answer to analyse the effects of the techniques throughout. So now you need to have a go yourself. So you can use the annotation notes from earlier in the video, and you can use the words and phrases on the bingo card to help you. You want to aim to write 3 more paragraphs. Good luck with your response and with your revision.